Hello, and welcome to Credibly Challenged, a podcast on bank risk management. My name is Matt Bisanz, and I'm a bank regulatory partner at the law firm of Mayer Brown. Joining me today is my good friend, Tilcia Toledo of FTI. She is a senior managing director. Thank you for being on my version of the program today, Tilcia.
Matt, thank you for having me. I'm super excited that we get a chance to have this conversation.
Yes. So I think that you have a lot of experience, again, more than 25 years working with financial institutions of all sizes, and you really have the opportunity to get in the weeds with many of your clients in ways that lawyers who are brought in more for episodic issues might not see. But what are some of the big trends that you've been working on in recent months?
So, Matt, yes, indeed, I have a lot of experience in financial services. I've been in the industry for more than 25 years. I started my career as a leverage finance investment banker and then spent some time at the FDIC. And now in consulting, I'm a senior managing director in the financial services practice. A lot of my work focuses on financial crime compliance. As you can imagine, with the developments with Russia and the Ukraine, we've been fairly and actively busy on a number of sanctions matters. So that has kept us pretty active, I would say, in the past couple of years, and it continues. And I also tend to focus on risk assessments. That's really one of the core areas for me. It's something that I've been doing for a very, very long time, and it's a key area of focus.
So one thing I've noticed about sanctions and other types of financial crime enforcement, and I'm certainly nowhere near as close to it as you are, but it seems like some of the headline grabbing penalty numbers, like the multi-billion-dollar penalties that we saw 5 or 10 years ago, there are fewer of those, but there are many more actions against smaller global banks or even non-banks who are engaged in commerce. What would you attribute that kind of shift and increase in number to?
I think that you're seeing a variety of different activities. And I will say that in our practice, interestingly enough, there are various different pockets. You have your traditional large banking institutions. You also have your very large, foreign bank organizations that maybe are not as familiar with the regulatory framework here in the US. And we do define financial services quite broadly. So we also look at money services businesses, fintech companies, crypto. So we've been working with the whole gamut of what would be defined as financial institutions. In terms of consent orders, I see everything from the very, very large ones to also some of the smaller ones. Ideally, I would love for my clients to come to me before there's a consent order that gets issued, but I realize that that's not always the case. And I think that it is important, nevertheless, regardless of what size you are, to be able to communicate a culture of compliance. And that's really what the regulators are getting at. Do you have a culture of compliance? Are you following the guidelines? Are you looking at your size and your complexity and adjusting the risk profile to address, the issues that you have based on your size and complexity?
Speaking of a culture of compliance, one theme that I think I've seen in some recent months, and I'd be interested to get your perspective on it, and probably not even just months, but years, is the rise of serious financial institutions that operate in the gray area of financial crime. That they might be a bank that serves the cannabis industry, or they might be a money transmitter that facilitates cryptocurrency activities, and things like that, where the underlying activity isn't necessarily for like crypto. It's not per se unlawful, but it also has a strong financial crime elements associated with it. And maybe 15 years ago, if you asked banks or money transmitters, they say, oh, we wouldn't touch that. We're de-risking that. And probably the big banks today still wouldn't touch those types of products. But you do have there are hundreds of banks that to one degree or another bank the cannabis industry, which is still federally illegal in the US. So how have you adjusted some of your counseling, or even on the investigation side, when you have banks who earnestly want to have a culture of compliance, but so much of their activities are in that gray area?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, I think calling it a gray area already gives it a little bit of suspicion, right? So
Mhm.
I don't know if I would categorize all of these as gray areas per se. I do think that the industry is facing pressure, and so people do look for yield, and so that makes you take a look at where do you want to go for yield, right? At FTI, we have had a cannabis practice for years. And so we actually have professionals that focus on that industry. I partner with them on a number of items. And so we know that space really, really well. And we will help whether it's, an institution. In some cases, what we're seeing also is you have the states who are in the process of making cannabis and marijuana legal, and they need some guidance in terms of what should we be asking for in terms of our KYC? How do we make sure that we capture the information that we need up front, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're capturing the right data. So we'll work with institutions on that process. I think due diligence is really important. And if you do have a culture of compliance, I think one of the things that we are used to hearing about all the time, because we are dealing with banks all day, every day, is the three lines of defense model. And introducing that model to other areas in the financial system that may not be as familiar, something that's really important. Does the business understand that, number one, they own the risk, right? So that's kind of like front and center. You as the business, you own the risk. And then you may have your risk professionals that serve as a second line of defense, and you have your audit function that serves as a third line of defense, and making sure that you have it set up in such a way that is very clear about what the roles are and what the responsibilities are. And, so that's part of your culture of compliance as well.
Yeah, the three line of defense model, I'm a big fan of it as well. And I think we've talked about it on some prior episodes of the podcast, and so hopefully the audience is as familiar with it. One part of it, though, that can be frustrating, I think, in my world is when there is instances of non-compliance that occur even in an institution that has a three lines of defense model, and they're reasonable. That it might be a global bank, and there was a bad actor in some regional office who subverted the three lines of defense, or there was collusion, or even just it was on a risk basis that the transaction just wouldn't necessarily be detected. And in hindsight, sure, we can say, yes, maybe the name was suspicious, there was no explained purpose. Um, but I'll sit there and say, like, this bank processed $100 million worth of payments a day, or this money transmitter had 6 million customers, the average size of which was typically under $1,000. And yes, this instance of non-compliance occurred, but any risk-based system will always have some instances of non-compliance. And that can be hard when you have regulators enforcing strict liability laws like the sanctions, like the economic sanctions. But I just find that sometimes, even within the three lines of defense, that you might have a third line saying, well, we view this program as ineffective because when we did it, this one part of our sample got through the test, or there was one instance of non-compliance. Or the other way I'll see it come up is on the second line when they're doing the periodic meetings to talk about, say, the number of rate or risk limit breaches. And they'll say, well, there was a risk limit breach here. Yes, there was a risk limit breach here, but it was relatively immaterial. It was identified. It was remediated appropriately. And so while, yes, we were operating in a yellow state for some period of time, we can never run the bank entirely in green all of the time. And so I think that's something sometimes I struggle with communicating to the second and third lines, is that yes, or even more so to the regulators, yes, we are trying our best, but we are never going to be perfect.
So I think that part of what you're talking about, it touches on a couple of different items. It touches on, first of all, what is the risk appetite of the institution? So, when I start working on a risk assessment, it's one of the first documents that I ask for. Sometimes People have it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes we need to spend some time creating a risk appetite statement. But I think that does get into, being very clear about what do you consider inside of the box and outside of the box. And then making sure that then you look at your controls, right? Are your policies and procedures clear? Do they clearly connect also and tie back to your risk appetite statement? Do you have all the various different controls that you need? Do you also have an exception process? Because I do agree with you that there are going to be circumstances where, yes, you have the rules of engagement, but you may need an exception, right? So I think early on, you have to be clear about what does the exception process look like? Who needs to approve it? How is it documented? And how long is this exception valid? And, the one thing that I also think about is when I look at somebody's exception process, if you have a lot of exceptions, maybe you need to take another look at your risk appetite statement. Maybe it doesn't serve you the way it used to serve you before, and your profile has changed. And so if your profile has changed, you do need to go back and document that. And that's why it's never going to be a one and done kind of situation. It's always going to be a process where you need to go over it multiple times and make sure that if you are outside of your risk appetite, that then people have the awareness to say, okay, what do we want to do? What are there additional controls that we need to put in place? Is this a business that we still want to be in, right? Is it worth the risk, right? Because you're never going to eliminate risk, but you do need to be able to manage it and also be clear about how it's part of your story. I think one thing that we help clients with quite a bit is just being clear about what is your story to the regulators? How does this all fit together with how you're doing business and conducting business, and being able to put your best foot forward? And I think a lot of times people don't take the time to pull that story together in a cohesive way. And then that also may raise eyebrows, let's put it that way.
Yeah. I think in one of the recent bank failures, there was some instance where there was maybe a concentration limit or some risk limit related to the amount of deposits coming from certain sectors, and the bank had actually identified that this was a limit it should try to manage to, but then it kept exceeding that limit.
Right.
And the solution at first was to approve the exceptions, and then finally someone was like, oh, we'll just increase the limit. And there was really no thought as to, well, we set the limit originally at something based on a risk assessment like you're describing. And yes, sure, we can just increase it, but what does that mean relative to our risk appetite and our risk exposure? And lo and behold, that bank, as we all know, failed. So yeah, that is, I think, an issue of not just putting in place the structures or the systems, but also ensuring there is, again, to the name of this, credible challenge of decisions being made.
And I do think that, concentration risk is one that we have seen, live cases on, lately. It's one of the areas. I will say the other area that we see a lot that also comes up is just, sometimes people have product risk. I think about the commercial real estate market right now. And if you're highly concentrated in commercial real estate, I'm sure that now is the time to take a look at that portfolio and see how it can be addressed and how it's going to change. The other area that I think requires additional attention is third-party risk. A lot of times, especially financial institutions, they may have third parties who do a variety of different functions, and you need to make sure that you have a good process in place to assess the third party risk that you're facing, and also be able to monitor, make changes, look at your service level agreements, take corrective action with your third parties if you need to. It is an area that we're seeing more and more, be elevated in terms of what the regulators review.
And I think so many times, at least what I hear in the industry, maybe not from my clients, but in the industry around third-party risk, are these unrealistic assumptions that you may be negotiating with a provider, a bank may be negotiating with a provider where there's only 3 or 4 providers, on a national basis. And so the idea that, well, we're going to drive a really tough bargain and make this provider have our compliance type programs, that probably isn't a realistic strategy for many banks. Or maybe even they get a bank gets a really good termination provision, a really good monitoring provision put in the agreement, but it's not realistic to think the bank would ever exercise it, that the effort to unwind the relationship, the ability to move to a new provider, the costs associated with moving to a new provider, that those just are unrealistic. And so while the bank may have gone in and said, look, we put in place our standard negotiation terms, we have all these rights to negotiate them, it just ends up not being realistic to execute on because of the structure of that particular product market. And so while the bank has done an effort at implementing third-party risk management, then you get into a situation where you can't follow through on it when times get tough.
Well, I think that I start from, is this something that should be outsourced or not, right? I mean, I think you almost have to make that determination early on, like, is this something that we want to outsource or not? Whether it's, something that is mission critical, something that you want to maintain because it's part of your crown jewel offering. So I think that's almost the first step. And then I think about, do you have the right resources to provide the oversight that would be necessary for this third party? So I think that's the other part that needs to be taken into consideration. And mind you, I mean, sometimes it's not just about cost. It could be things about, when are you notified if there's a breach, right? There's so many other service level agreement language that can be introduced in addition to some of the other ones that you mentioned, Matt.
Yeah. And speaking around the idea of, is it something that you even want to outsource, that I know there has been a huge transition to doing things as a service. And so there's software as a service, banking as a service, all types of things being done as a service. And we at Mayer Brown have a massive group that negotiates these arrangements, but that presumes that you do want to outsource that service. And sometimes I think there have been organizations that go down that path without realizing that, hey, wait a second, if I'm paying per head for this software, per head count for this software, and now I have to pay that for every part of my software, I'm going to have this massive software bill in the long term as I grow my business. Do I want that, or do I want to keep it in-house as a managed function? Or maybe I want to outsource this type of transaction capability, but if it takes off and now I have customers using it relentlessly, that's great. But if I passed on all of the benefit to the provider of the service, that have they negotiated where they get the lion's share of the benefit from all these transactions? And some people may say, yes, that's worth it to me based on my fee arrangements. Other people may need to reevaluate if that's something they really want to outsource.
I completely agree. I also think about just how important data is nowadays, that you want to be clear about who owns the data, right? And a lot of times those conversations happen too late in the process, and they should be taking place a lot sooner, about who owns the data, who manages the data, how is it cleaned up. Because when you need to have certain reports or certain information, you just want to make sure that you have access to the data that you need, right? And so I've come across situations like that where we're doing an engagement and we're trying to figure out certain information, and we need to go to a third party to get some critical information.
Yeah, that's true. That's really true. To turn things maybe a little bit to more focus on the risk assessment piece, I was wondering if we could transition that. I recently, or I guess a couple months ago, attended the American Bankers Association compliance conference. It was in San Antonio. It was a great time. There were about 1,400 people on site. And one of the things that I kept hearing from attendees that surprised me or made me think was the number of people who said, I am the only person at my bank who does X or Y, or I am the only compliance person at my bank. And again, coming from a big law firm and you working at a big consulting firm with these global banks, we are used to there being 8 people on every call with us. That when we're brought in for a project, it's all hands on deck, and that means dozens, if not more, people, probably in some of your larger investigations. Um, or I've been on some risk assessments where, again, there are hundreds of people across a banking organization involved in the risk assessment process. But as the regulators now push some of these risk management expectations down, hopefully not to the banks with only one compliance officer, but to some of the smaller banks, what are you seeing as some of the challenges, even engaging someone like an FTI to help build out a program?
So I'll tell you, I've seen the whole spectrum, right? I've seen some banks that maybe you have a small branch, and maybe you did one before, but you maybe hired somebody else, and now you need help because you want to make sure that you have more of a grasp around your risk assessment, right? And I'll tell you this. I mean, for me, I start with data, right? I think that at the end of the day, you want your risk assessment to be data driven. And I think it's really important, whoever is doing the risk assessment, to be able to pull the information that they need from reports, you know, from other people also, if it resides with others, and just be able to get a team together actually. And even if it's just the individual who's doing the risk assessment, the individual who's doing the risk assessment will need to reach out to the business folks, because a lot of times when you pull the data, you look at it and you're like, wait a minute, does this make sense, right? So you almost need to validate the information that you're looking at every step of the way, right? So so I will take a look at who are your customers, right? And getting a sense for how are they ranked, how are they rated, what is the risk profile of your customers look like. We'll take a look at your products and services. And do you have any emerging products that we need to be thinking about, right? We'll take a look at geography. Where are you today? Where are you looking to be also in the future? But, geography can be interesting depending on what risk you're focused on, right? There's a difference between looking at a BSA AML risk assessment and doing an OFAC sanctions risk assessment. So that's also important to make sure that it's delineated. And then operations is one that you hear about all the time, and that may roll into the third-party risk that we've talked about, the cybersecurity risk and other areas, and even just channel, like how do you onboard your clients? So those are kind of like some of the key areas. Now, in terms of how broad and deep it is, yes, I've also been at firms where there's like 8, 10 plus people who are working on a risk assessment. And as soon as they're done with the one for this year, they're working on the next one, right? Just because it takes that amount of time to gather all the information, process all the information, get your inherent risk, figure out what your control scores are, and then come up with your residual risk. And it may just take a full cycle to be able to go through that. I think what's really important is to be clear about why you're doing the risk assessment. So at the end of the day, when you're looking at the results, what is your action plan based on the risk assessment? Is it being used to decide what your priorities should be in terms of your controls going forward, and where you may have some gaps? Is it being used to determine resources? How are you using your risk assessment? It's really important that it's part of an action plan. And then related to that is, when I look at the results, if I look at a risk assessment and everything is high, that's not really useful. And if I look at a risk assessment and everything is low, that's not really useful either, right? Because the whole point is it should help you prioritize, your actions going forward. So you want to make sure that you're looking at things, and you may need to recalibrate, right? And make sure that you're validating the information along the way.
Yeah, I think that is really a struggle for many of the regional and super regional banks out there. Probably not the super regionals anymore, but as you get down more into the regional market, is that sustainability of the risk management process or the risk assessment process, that it's we're often hired on an engagement basis, which I assume is similar to your model, where we'll come in, we might either do a risk assessment, define a risk assessment program, but typically the bank won't hire us to do it every cycle. That they'll either forget what they're going to do next cycle, or they will um, assume that the person internally is capable of executing it for the next cycle. And unless there is a training or an educational component built into the engagement, I think we often find that that doesn't carry over. And so let alone trying to implement the findings or remediate the findings from the risk assessment, like you just described, there is the, well, how are we going to do this every year? Do we have the resources to do this every year? That I think we saw that with some of the things around cybersecurity, that was, first in vogue, say 10 years ago. And then those same people were getting pulled into doing third party risk assessments. And now those people are trying to be retrained on how to do financial risk assessments. Um, and in an organization with limited capacity, doing all of those risk assessments every cycle probably requires a long-term investment.
And I'll say, well, I mean, training is typically a part of our engagements. So when we get hired to, it could be either to review a risk assessment. So I'm providing guidance and saying, take a look at this. You need to adjust this. What about that? Right. So in that situation, I'm reviewing something that a client has pulled together, and they're just looking for advice on how to make it better and stronger. Right. And so that's one part. And in other situations, I'm being asked to actually like do the risk assessment, right? So in that situation, I am working with them hand in hand, step by step, going through, here's our process. We will document our risk assessment methodology. We will document the procedure. We will talk about what kind of tool do you want to use? What is it that works for your institution, right? Because you can build something that's very sophisticated, but if it's not going to be used, it's not, there's no value there. So we'll spend time talking about that, and then we'll do a training afterwards to make sure that everybody's clear on what the different levels are, how it's rated, what are the different categories, so on and so forth. So we do tend to kind of like go through that training. And I have been in situations where we get hired to, say, do a risk assessment every other year for an institution. And in that case, it's nice because you've done the work with them already. You understand the organization really well. And then you're able to make tweaks and adjustments so that it's stronger and stronger each and every single time. I still go back to the one thing that I think is really important is to get the data as clean as possible, because the first time you do a risk assessment, there's just a lot of noise. And so you're trying to eliminate the noise, and then going forward, okay, this is what we need, this is how we need it, and then you're able to pull the data up the proper way. I think the second thing is to make sure that you're validating the data, right? Whether, because the risk professional needs to make sure that they're partnering with the business professionals to be able to say, here's what your customer profile looks like. Does this make sense, right? And they may be able to say, wait a minute, you're missing this, you're missing that, because you never know if there's other information that's not maintained in that master database, right? So or there's a different there's a different ticker that you have to use to be able to get to that specific customer base, right? So I think it's really important to engage the business on it, and then again, it needs to be something that the organization is going to be able to use and understand. So you do need to engage everybody. Like normally, what I'm used to seeing is that there's a kickoff, right? Where you are dealing with not just the risk professional, but also the business, so that everybody understands what are the expectations and how you actually get to the finished product and how you want to use the final product. In the final product, a lot of times you may realize that, oh my goodness, our residual risk in this specific category is a lot higher than what we intended. This was not in line with our risk appetite statement. So we need to figure out how are we going to get it back in line? What additional controls are we going to put in place? So every now and then people do get surprised when they get their results.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And you certainly probably do see a much broader spectrum of the stakeholders than we see coming in, because we usually come in through a legal function or through a business function, whereas you are leading those kickoff meetings. And there is for the podcast a bit of an educational component that what is something that you wish lawyers either inside a bank or outside counsel could do to better help the process? That's something when you see that lawyer in the room, you're like, I really hope they don't do this, or could they please just do this? That would help out the engagement, the business, the organization so much more.
I would say that I think what's really important is to be properly aligned, right? I mean, I think you want to be clear about what is the end goal here? What are we trying to do? I think that if everybody's properly aligned, it goes a lot smoother. Like and mind you, when I'm doing an engagement, I wear different hats depending on the kind of engagements. There's some engagements where we're there and we're working with a client to remediate something specific. And so we're working really on their behalf. And in that kind of situation, it's like, look, we are on your side. Like, let's make sure that counsel understands that we are all on the same team, right? So that's one kind of situation. There are some situations where I'm in there as a monitor, right?
Mhm.
So that's a very different kind of hat, right? And so in that kind of situation, I think what's really important is to try to be as clear as possible and just be clear when there's deadlines, which sometimes we can manage, sometimes we can't. But just being as clear as possible about what state are you at right now, right? I think that when somebody comes in and when I come in, for example, and somebody says, "Oh, we've completed it. It's done. It's fully remediated." If it's not fully remediated, that's not helpful. But if you say, "Listen, here's where we are in the process. We've done A and B. We're still in the process of doing C," that
Mhm.
helps me as I'm doing my review. Just the recognition that of where somebody is in the remediation process, I think is helpful.
Okay, that's a really helpful perspective. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for taking the time to be on the program, Tilcia. It's always great to get your perspective, and I know you have your own podcast as well. That if you, I hope the audience tunes into that one. What's the name of that one again?
Sure. So, Matt, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast.
Mhm.
The name of my podcast is Finance and Leadership. The cadence is quarterly now. When we first launched it, it was monthly, but right now we are doing a quarterly cadence, and we will certainly be able to share this episode. And I always enjoy our conversations. We talk often, sometimes just at
Mhm.
a coffee shop about
Yeah.
what are we seeing, what are we seeing in the industry, client behavior, so on and so forth. So I always appreciate being able to catch up with you, Matt.
Well, thank you so much. And also, I want to thank our audience for listening. Without you, we wouldn't have a reason to do podcasts like this. So thank you for tuning in and tune in for the next episode of Credibly Challenged. Have a great day.